He was the president of his church council, a Cub Scout leader who taught children how to tie knots and earn badges, a compliance officer who neighbors trusted to enforce the rules. For 31 years, Dennis Rader lived two lives so perfectly separated that even his own family, his wife of 34 years, his daughter who adored him, his son who looked up to him, had no idea they were sleeping under the same roof as one of America's most sadistic serial killers. But here's what makes this story different from every other monster you've heard about. Dennis Rader wasn't caught because of brilliant detective work. He wasn't turned in by a suspicious neighbor. He wasn't identified through a lucky break. Dennis Rader was caught because he asked the police a question, and he believed them when they lied. Before we dive in, if you're interested in the psychology behind cases like this, hit that subscribe button. We're going deep into the criminal mind today, and you won't want to miss what comes next. March 9th, 1945, Pittsburgh, Kansas. A baby boy is born who will grow up to be normal, unremarkably, devastatingly normal. Dennis Lynn Rader had a Midwestern boyhood filled with fishing trips, comic books, and scout meetings. To everyone who knew him, he was just another kid playing in the streets, riding his bike, doing his homework. His parents raised him in a stable home alongside his three younger brothers. But behind closed doors, something was different. Young Dennis was developing interests that his parents didn't see. Interests that, decades later, psychologists would recognize as warning signs. But in 1950s Kansas, nobody was watching. Nobody was connecting any dots because there were no dots to connect. Yet, Dennis Rader served in the U.S. Air Force in the 1960s and received an honorable discharge. On May 22, 1971, he married Paula Dietz, a secretary, in a ceremony at Christ Lutheran Church. They seemed like the perfect couple, the kind you'd see at church potlucks and neighborhood barbecues. In 1974, Dennis got a job with ADT Security Services. Think about that for a moment. He would spend the next 14 years installing alarm systems in people's homes. Families would open their doors and invite Dennis Rader inside to make them feel safe. They would show him their bedroom windows, their back doors, their vulnerabilities. They would trust him with keys and access codes. And some of those families would later become statistics. Paula and Dennis had two children, a son named Brian born in 1975, and a daughter named Carrie born in 1978. To those kids, Dennis Rader was just Dad, the guy who drove them to school, attended their soccer games, helped with homework. Maybe he was a little strict sometimes, maybe a little particular about rules. But he was there. He was present. By 1991, Dennis had become a compliance officer in Park City, Kansas, the kind of man who'd write you a citation if your grass was too tall or your fence violated code. Neighbors described him as rigid, a little annoying maybe, but reliable, someone who followed the rules to the letter. He was president of his church congregation council at Christ Lutheran Church. Parents trusted him to lead their children in Cub Scouts, teaching them camping skills and moral values. He taught kids how to tie knots. Proper knots. Secure knots. Knots that wouldn't come loose no matter how hard you pulled. At home, Paula thought she had a devoted, if somewhat distant husband. Brian and Carrie thought they had a loving father, who was just a bit quirky, maybe a little too obsessed with order and control. This is the most terrifying thing about Dennis Rader. He wasn't hiding in shadows. He was right there, in plain sight, living what appeared to be the most ordinary, boring, middle American life imaginable. Psychologists call this compartmentalization, the ability to separate different aspects of one's life into isolated mental boxes. It's what allows someone to be a devoted father at breakfast and something else entirely by nightfall. To kiss your wife goodnight, and then lie awake thinking about things she could never imagine. For 31 years, Dennis Rader kept his family life, his church life, his work life, and his secret life in completely separate compartments. He could maintain multiple identities without any of them bleeding into the others. No slip-ups, no mistakes, no cracks in the mask. When asked years later how he managed it, Rader gave a chilling answer: I compartmentalized it. It was like having a separate life. But his separate life had a name. He called it BTK, bind, torture, kill. And for the people of Wichita, Kansas, That name would become synonymous with terror. Between 1974 and 1991, the city of Wichita lived in fear. Someone was hunting, someone was killing, and nobody knew who or when they'd strike next or why they chose the victims they chose. The letters started arriving in October 1974. One was dropped inside a book at the Wichita Public Library. Inside was a detailed confession to murders that police were still investigating. The writer described what he'd done with cold precision, like he was explaining a recipe or giving directions. He signed it with name, BTK. He wrote, "I can't stop it. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK. More letters followed. Phone calls to reporters. Packages left in public places. Each one was a taunt, a game, a way of saying, I'm still here. You can't catch me. I'm smarter than all of you. For Wichita, those 17 years between 1974 and 1991 were a waking nightmare. Women changed their locks. People bought guns. Parents walked their children to school. Neighborhoods that had never locked their doors started installing deadbolts and security systems. Ironically, many of those security systems were installed by Dennis Rader. The victims weren't random, but there was no clear pattern. Young women, older women, families, individuals living alone. They were attacked in their homes, places where they should have been safest. The method was always similar: binding, control, strangulation, but the intervals between attacks were unpredictable. Months would pass, then years, then suddenly another letter, another body. Kevin Bright, whose sister was murdered in 1974, survived his own attack and lived the rest of his life haunted by what he witnessed. Maureen Hedges' children lost their mother in 1985. The families of these victims formed a community of grief, bound together by shared trauma and unanswered questions. Police worked the cases obsessively. Tips poured in by the thousands. Suspects were questioned and cleared. The investigation consumed resources, manpower, and hope. But BTK remained a ghost, a voice in letters, a presence in nightmares, but never a face, never a name, never a person they could handcuff and lock away. And then, after 1991, silence. 13 years of silence. Many thought BTK was dead. Some speculated he'd been imprisoned for another crime. Others believed he'd moved away or simply stopped. Police kept the case files open, but leads dried up. The investigation went cold. Wichita slowly, cautiously began to breathe again. The fear didn't disappear. It just settled into background, became part of the city's history rather than its present. Parents still told their children to lock their doors. Women still felt that tingle of awareness walking to their cars at night. But life went on. Dennis Rader went on too. He raised his teenagers. He enforced compliance codes. He led scout meetings. He served on the church council. Nobody suspected him of anything more serious than being annoyingly rigid about parking regulations. The mask never slipped. Not once. But in 2004, something changed. The Wichita Eagle published a retrospective article. BTK Case Unsolved, 30 years later. Dennis Rader read that article in his living room, and he felt something stir inside him, something that had been quiet for 13 years but never really gone. He later told investigators he was kind of bored and felt like the article wasn't giving him proper credit for what he'd done. After 13 years of silence, his narcissism woke up hungry, so BTK came back. In March 2004, a package appeared at a Wichita television station. Inside were photographs, crime scene photos that only the killer could have, photos of a victim that police hadn't released to the public. Along with the photos was a letter. BTK was back. More packages followed over the next year. Letters to newspapers. Word puzzles. A doll bound with pantyhose and a plastic bag over its head, left in a public place. Each communication was a breadcrumb, a clue, a taunt. He was playing a game, and he wanted the world to know he was still out there. Police realized they had a golden opportunity. If they could keep BTK talking, maybe, just maybe, he'd make a mistake. So they responded. They placed messages in newspaper classified ads. They engaged with him, stroked his ego, made him feel important. It was a dangerous strategy. Every communication carried the risk that he'd get spooked and disappear again, but it was also their best shot at finally catching him after 30 years. The Wichita Police Task Force, led by Detective Ken Landwehr, worked around the clock analyzing every word, every clue. They brought in FBI profilers. They studied the syntax of his letters, the psychology behind his taunts. They knew they were dealing with someone intelligent, organized, and deeply narcissistic, someone who needed recognition for his work. And then, in one of the communications, BTK asked a question that would change everything. He wanted to know if he could communicate via a floppy disk. Would it be safe? Could they trace it? The task force saw their opening. This was it, the mistake they'd been waiting for. But they had to be careful. They had to make him feel safe, make him trust them. So they lied. Detective Landwehr crafted a response and placed it as a classified ad in the Wichita Eagle. Rex, it will be okay. 3 simple words. A promise from the police to serial killer. A promise they had absolutely no intention of keeping. February 16th, 2005. Dennis Rader sat at his desk at Christ Lutheran Church, where he served as council president. He was probably alone in the office, door closed, confident in his cleverness. He inserted a purple floppy disk into the computer and created a document. Then, thinking he was being extra careful, he deleted the document from the disk. He put the floppy disk into a padded envelope and drove to a Home Depot parking lot, where he left it for police to find. Dennis Rader drove home feeling satisfied, feeling smart, feeling like he was in control of the game. He had no idea that in that single moment, he'd handed police everything they needed to destroy his entire life. When Wichita police retrieved the floppy disk, they rushed it to their forensic computer lab. The disk appeared empty. Dennis had deleted the document, just like he planned. But here's what Dennis Rader didn't understand about computers in 2005. Deleting a file doesn't actually delete it. Forensic computer analysts have tools that can recover deleted files, can see the digital fingerprints left behind, can read the metadata, the hidden information embedded in every document created on a computer. Information like what computer was it created on, what software was used, who was logged into the computer. When the analysts recovered the deleted file and examined its metadata, they found 2 pieces of information that made their hearts race. The document was last modified by someone named Dennis, and it was created at Christ Lutheran Church. 5 minutes of Google searching later, they had a name, Dennis Rader, president of the church council at Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. But they couldn't arrest someone based solely on metadata. They needed physical evidence. They needed DNA. And this is where the story takes a heartbreaking turn, because the DNA they needed would come from someone who had no idea what her father really was. Carrie Rader was 26 years old in February 2005. She was a student at Kansas State University, studying, building a future, completely innocent and unaware. At some point in her college years, she'd had a routine pap smear at the student medical clinic, just a normal health screening that millions of women get. That medical sample was still on file. Police obtained a court order for that sample. They compared the DNA from Carrie's pap smear to DNA that had been found on the fingernails of Vicki Wegerle, a woman who'd been murdered in her home in 1986, 19 years earlier. A woman who'd fought her attacker, scratched him, left his genetic material under her nails before she died. The DNA analysis came back. Familial match. The killer was Carrie Rader's biological father. Think about what that means for a moment. Carrie Rader's own DNA, taken from her body during a routine medical exam, without her knowledge or consent, became the evidence that would convict her father of being one of America's most notorious serial killers. February 25th, 2005, Dennis Rader was driving home for lunch from his compliance officer job, probably thinking about what he'd eat, maybe about mowing the lawn or some violation he needed to write up. Completely routine, completely normal. Then police cars surrounded him, lights flashing, officers with guns drawn. He pulled over, confused but compliant. Even as they cuffed him and read him his rights, he seemed almost impressed with himself, like this was a grand finale he'd been building toward for 30 years. At the police station, after they booked him and sat him down in an interrogation room, Dennis Rader asked him, "How'd you catch me?" When they told him about the floppy disk metadata, his face changed. The smugness drained away. He looked genuinely shocked. "Can they really trace floppy disks?" he asked, his voice smaller now. "I thought you said it was safe." Detective Lambert looked him dead in the eye and said, "Yeah, we lied to you." Dennis Rader, the man who'd spent 31 years believing he was smarter than everyone else, the man who'd outsmarted police for decades, the man who'd killed at least 10 people and gotten away with it for most of his adult life, had been caught because he trusted the police who'd been hunting him to tell him the truth. His narcissism had finally killed him. Now, with Dennis Rader in custody, the full scope of his crimes could finally be revealed to the public. What police had known from evidence and letters, what the families of victims had suffered through for decades, could now be spoken aloud with name attached. Between January 1974 and January 1991, Dennis Rader had murdered at least 10 people. January 15th, 1974, the Otero family, Joseph 38, Julie 34, Josephine 11, and Joseph Jr. 9. An entire family erased before breakfast. Josephine was taken to the basement, hanged from a pipe, strangled, revived, and strangled again while he photographed her body. April 4th, 1974. Catherine Bright, 21, was stabbed multiple times and shot. Her brother Kevin was also shot, but survived and lived the rest of his life haunted by what he witnessed. His sister's murder and his own helplessness to stop it. March 17th, 1977. Shirley Vian, 26, was strangled with a rope in her home. Her terrified children, locked in a bathroom, listened to their mother die. December 8th, 1977. Nancy Fox, 25, was strangled in her bed in her own apartment. April 27th, 1985. Maureen Hedge, 53, Rader's neighbor who lived just houses away, was strangled and her body dumped in a ditch. September 16th, 1986. Vicky Wegerle, 28, was strangled in her home. She fought back, scratched her attacker, left his DNA under her fingernails, evidence that would sit in a freezer for 19 years, until Carrie Rader's DNA gave police the connection they needed. January 18th, 1991. Dolores Davis, 62, was strangled and her body dumped under a bridge. After each murder, Rader would take trophies, driver's licenses, underwear, jewelry, personal items. He stored them in a secret hiding spot. And sometimes, when Paula and the kids were away, he would dress up in his victims' clothing, put on a female mask, tie himself up, and take photographs, reliving his crimes, pretending to be his victims, satisfying the dark fantasies that had driven him since childhood. He called these his self-bonded sessions. In these private moments, he called himself Cupcake. The man who taught children how to tie knots in Cub Scouts was using those same knots on himself, on his victims, feeding a compulsion that had consumed him for decades. In June 2005, Dennis Rader pleaded guilty to all 10 murders. Kansas didn't have the death penalty during the years his crimes were committed, so execution was never an option. He would receive 10 consecutive life sentences, effectively ensuring he'd die in prison. But before sentencing, the court held allocution hearings where Rader described each murder in cold, methodical detail. He referred to his victims as projects. He spoke like he was describing how he'd installed someone's security system or fixed a leaky faucet. No emotion, no remorse, just facts. The courtroom was packed with families of the victims. As Rader spoke, they wept, they cursed, they held each other. Decades of wondering, of nightmares, of unanswered questions were finally being addressed. But the answers were so much worse than they'd imagined. And sitting there among them, trying to process the impossible, was Carrie Rader. Imagine being 26 years old and learning that your father, the man who raised you, who taught you to ride a bike, who drove you to school every day, who you loved, is BTK, the serial killer who terrorized your city for your entire childhood. The monster you've been afraid of living in the closet or under the bed was actually sleeping down the hall. And then learning that your DNA helped convict him, that your own genetic material, taken from your body without your knowledge, became evidence that sent your father to prison for life. Paula Rader divorced Dennis immediately. She released a statement saying she'd had no knowledge of his crimes and had been deceived like everyone else. After 34 years of marriage, she had to accept that the man she'd shared a bed with, raised children with, built a life with, was a stranger, a monster wearing her husband's face. But for Carrie and her brother Brian, it was more complicated. This wasn't a stranger or even an extended family member. This was the man who'd raised them. Every memory they had, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations, bedtime stories, was now contaminated, poisoned. How do you mourn the father you thought you had, while simultaneously confronting the reality of who he actually was? The aftermath. Dennis Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences with the possibility of parole after 175 years. He's currently housed at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. He's elderly now, in his late 70s, wheelchair-bound, his body failing him in ways his mind never did during those 31 years of killing. Carrie visited him in 2023 and later described him as rotting, physically diminished, having lost 7 inches in height. She said there was no one behind those eyes anymore. But the story didn't end with his conviction. In August 2023, investigators announced that Dennis Rader was a prime suspect in at least 2 more murders. 16-year-old Cynthia Dawn Kinney, who disappeared in Oklahoma in 1976, and 22-year-old Shauna Beth Garber, who was killed in Missouri in 1990. Investigators found possible trophies buried in a hiding spot on his former property, items that suggest his body count might be higher than 10. Much higher. The investigation is ongoing. More victims may yet be identified. More families may yet learn the truth about what happened to their loved ones decades ago. But Dennis Rader isn't cooperating. Without the cameras, without the attention, without the ability to control the narrative and play his game, he has nothing to say. And in 2024, Carrie Rader revealed something that added yet another layer of horror to an already unbearable story. At CrimeCon, she presented excerpts from her father's journal, writings that strongly suggested he had sexually abused her as a child, memories she'd buried, trauma she'd blocked out. Suddenly it all made horrific sense. The father who'd tucked her in at night, who'd taught her to tie her shoes, who'd walked her down the aisle at her wedding. He hadn't just been a serial killer hiding in plain sight. He'd been abusing his own daughter. Today, Dennis Rader remains exactly where he will stay for the rest of his life. He is incarcerated at El Dorado Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in Kansas, serving 10 consecutive life sentences for 10 murders. There is no possibility of parole. He will never be released. Now in his late 70s, Rader is described as physically frail with declining health. Reports indicate he spends much of his time alone, under strict supervision, living a tightly controlled routine like every other inmate serving life. His days are quiet, repetitive, and largely forgotten by the world he once terrorized. He no longer controls the narrative. He no longer commands attention. The man who craved recognition and feared obscurity now exists in isolation, stripped of authority, stripped of identity, reduced to an inmate number inside concrete walls. While investigators continue to examine possible links to other unsolved cases, Dennis Rader himself has offered little of value and no genuine accountability beyond what the courts already force from him. His victims do not get another day. Their families do not get closure that time can fully heal. But Dennis Rader will never harm anyone again. And that is how his story ends. Not with infamy, not with power, but with silence, confinement, and a lifetime behind bars. This has been the story of BTK, the man who trusted the police who were hunting him. Subscribe for more true crime stories that go deeper than the headlines. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, evil hides in plain sight.